This is a free one.
Did you get one?
All right.
No.
All right, so before we get started, did everyone get a chance to vote? Okay, great. So thanks again for coming today. We usually do this is our second time doing it. We had a much larger crowd the first time around, so thanks again for showing up. This is an event where we try to at least provide a little information about what's on the ballot. And so today we're going to be talking about TABOR. And I always like to start off with a little bit of a joke. So what are the two certainties in life? Death and taxes, right? But what's the difference between death and taxes? Death doesn't get worse after the legislature meets. I like that joke. I like that joke specifically because it's a little different here in Colorado. It's not the same because we have something unique here in Colorado called the Taxpayer Bill of Rights. And we're the only state to have this protection built into our state constitution. And before I get into that, I want to do a little bit of housekeeping because that's what we're going to be talking about is TABOR and also Proposition CC. If you haven't been at one of these events before, we provide this for free as a service. My name is Jay Stooksbury. I'm the chair of the Libertarian Party here in Delta County. With me, I've got a couple of our other board members. Scott Flogg in the back, who's working our table. Scott, raise your hand. Keith is also part of our board. He's kind of just I don't know what position you have. Yeah, he's going to be our timekeeper for this event. And we do this event for free because we want people to be informed. We want them to know what's the issues and better understand them. And if you wouldn't mind, please consider making a donation to us. It could be as small as $1, $5. If you keep it under 20, we don't have to report your name to the state. So that's something that libertarians are obviously very eager to avoid. We really try to also focus on civility. You know, we're here to talk about issues that, you know, if you open up your cell phone and go on Facebook, you're going to see a lot of rage wars going on about the issues. And I'm a big fan of people getting together and actually having a conversation, because I think you're going to find that there's obviously some place in the middle that most of us can meet. But I think ultimately what we want to try to do here is make sure that folks have a chance to speak their minds, but also have a good conversation about it. Because at the end of the day, we're all neighbors, we're all friends, and we need to work together somehow too. So if we could, make sure we don't do any jeering, booing, anything like that. When I introduce our guests, we'll obviously applaud for them then, but then let's hold applause till the very end of the debate, okay? And we're going to be doing what's called an Oxford-style debate. We're going to break it up into 4 different sections. The first will be a 10-minute introduction from each of our speakers. They will be discussing what is the resolution for the evening, and the resolution is the following. The Taxpayer Bill of Rights is outdated and requires reform. Reforms such as Proposition CC. And so they'll have a first round of 10 minutes to introduce themselves, introduce their opening arguments. We'll then do a second round where they'll have a chance to rebut what was discussed during the first round. A third round will be dedicated to question and answers. So if you guys have questions for them, we have cards to fill out in the back. Feel free to fill one out. Make sure you write a question. The last time we did this, I had a gentleman who submitted 3 cards, front and back. That was a diatribe about the Electoral College, which I didn't read because it wasn't a question. So we try to keep it brief, try to keep it concise, because we have a limited amount of time. And then we'll have the 4th round, which will be 5 minutes. Each speaker will have a chance to offer closing remarks. So without further ado, I'll introduce our members here. So. Arguing in the affirmative of the resolution will be Dan Thurlow. Dan is graduated from Grand Junction High School in 1965, attended Colorado State University, and returned to Grand Junction to join Colorado Printing Company in 1969. The company, now known as CPC NewTek, did I get that right? Specializes in commercial printing and packaging and employs approximately 120 people in Colorado, Utah, and Nevada. Retiring in 2005, Thurlow ran for the House District 55 seat in Grand Junction in the Colorado legislature, serving 2 terms from 2015 to 2018. Thurlow is now retired, living in Parker with his wife, Marcia, who also joined us. Thank you, Marcia. He has 3 children, 2 stepchildren, and 7 grandchildren. And he also literally flew here just for this event, too. So let's give a round of applause. And then arguing in the negative of the proposition is Rose Puglisi. Did I get that right? Rose is, or has served in District 3 County Commissioner in Mesa County since 2013. Puglisi graduated with honors from Villanova University with a bachelor's degree in sociology and a minor in Japanese, which we'll expect her to phrase her debate in Japanese at some point. She attended St. John's University School of Law and is licensed to practice law in Colorado, New York, and Florida. She is a dedicated community member, a member of the local Rotary Club, and participates in many community service and pro bono projects. Rose lives in Orchard Mesa with her husband and her 2 young children. So let's give a round of applause for Rose. And without further ado, we'll bring Dan up for his opening argument. So Dan.
Well, thank you, Jay. Thank you very much. Thank all of you for being here. It's great to have people come out on a Saturday afternoon and be involved in these discussions. I want to thank Rose for being here. I've known Rose for a long time. I never, ever would have known that she understood Japanese. So, TABOR. I am a strong TABOR supporter. It was passed, just for review, it was in 1992 that it was passed and became part of our Constitution. I voted for it then. I support it now. I think it's gone a long ways toward helping Colorado do something that's really hard to do, and that's keep a limited government. What I would suggest to you, though, is that when you have any kind of a policy, as Jay said, I come from a printing background, and in printing we're driven by procedures and processes and continuous improvement. And I bet any of you, whatever you do in your life, your personal life, or your business, or your church, or your school, I bet you look at processes and say a great deal of the success or failure of an organization depends on the process that they use. And processes are never perfect. You always start them, you do it for a while, you see things that are wrong, you see some of it that's right, you have times change, the internet changes things for everybody, so you constantly update your process. Here's my premise then today, is that TABOR's good, and it's good for 2 reasons. One is the ability to vote. The people have to be able to vote on tax rate changes and tax policy changes. That's the way TABOR's worded. Tax rate changes and policy changes. We get to vote on those in Colorado, and I think that's good. And then the second part, that's really not part of TABOR, but it's in our Constitution, is that we have to have a balanced budget. The legislature cannot adjourn for the year without a budget being passed that is in balance. Well, that's the constraint. Those 2 things are the hard constraint on the Colorado legislature and the Colorado governor, so that they can't spend more than we take in and more than the economy provides. Here's what I think is become apparent to me, and this didn't become apparent to me until I got in the legislature, but as I got there, and you look at what's called the TABOR excess revenue cap, which is what Proposition CC does. If it passes, it'll remove the excess revenue cap. The excess revenue cap is defined as inflation plus population growth. So if inflation is 2%, which it kind of has been for a lot of years now, population is 1% growth, for instance, the state budget can only grow year over year by 3%. That makes a lot of sense until you start looking at the history of TABOR, and when you really start thinking about it a little deeper, what that means is there's always a ratchet down effect, because if the budget, we've had TABOR in effect for about 27 years now, if you have 5 years of good growth and the growth is 7 or 8% in sales tax receipts and income tax receipts, and you have to, and the state gives back the money because they can't keep more than 3%, And then you hit one year where we have a downturn, and those of us that have lived in western Colorado for a while certainly know that that time does come in Colorado when you have a downturn. When you have that happen, as it did in say 2007, 8, and 9, the budget actually decreases. Well, inflation plus population growth is irrelevant then. There's no money to keep. So it is a mathematical certainty that over the long term, the state budget cannot grow at the rate of population and inflation because it's the wrong measure. And that's what's happened if you look at the Colorado budget. And one thing I want to make clear is you have to distinguish in the Colorado budget. There's a general fund. I think this year it's about 13 or 14 billion dollars, and that's made up of sales tax, income tax, and some fees. But it's not the whole budget. The whole budget is about 33 or 34 billion dollars this year, and most of all that portion of the budget is federal funds, gas tax, different things like that. And it's huge amounts, but it's outside of the general fund, and it's outside of what is controlled by the TABOR excess revenue cap. If you look, I don't know if any of you picked up this handout when you came in, but it's a recap of what's happened since 1992. And I just got it when I went to the legislature in 2015. I saw it, and that's so I'm sorry I didn't get it updated till today, but the trend has to continue. That to me is a measure of what's happening under TABOR with the excess revenue cap in place. The amount of revenue in the general fund continues to decrease every year. You might think that was a good thing to begin with. Maybe the government was too big. But my question is, do you want it to continue on into infinity? The other graph that I thought I would show you is one of the faults of the excess revenue cap is it defines inflation as the Denver-Boulder Consumer Price Index. Well, that's the stuff that we all buy, groceries and things that we buy in our personal life. Government usually buys buildings and roads. This is something called the Colorado Construction Index. And you can see how it is vastly, it's very cyclical, but it's vastly outgrown the Consumer Price Index over the last 10 or 20 years. I want to tell you, again, this is a quick story because I know I'll run out of time, but a quick story about my education in the TABOR excess revenue cap. When I first got to the state legislature, my first term, they throw at you 600 bills, and when you're new, you're sort of lost anyway. But what they do is with every bill that comes out, they give you a fiscal note along with it. When we are up against the excess revenue cap, which we were in 2015, the fiscal note has a TABOR paragraph in it. It says what will be, when we're up against the cap, it means we're going to pay refunds. The TABOR note says, here's what the refund will be. Here's how this bill will affect the refund. One of the first bills that came up with is a fairly small bill. It was a group of nurses and physical trainers that worked in Colorado. There's a consortium of states, Wyoming, Nebraska, Utah, I think New Mexico, that they formed a consortium and they share licenses for nurses and other health care practitioners across state lines so that you don't have to be licensed in every state in order to work in those areas. A nurse from Delta could go to Moab and work without having a Utah license. The practitioners in Colorado wanted to join that consortium. They had to have a government scorekeeper to say, all right, here's the list of people that are licensed in Colorado as a nurse, a registered nurse, a physical therapist, all these different categories. And it kind of had to be a government. It's one of the things that, whether you like government or not, there are probably some things that only a government can do to be credible with the other states in the consortium. So as people brought a bill to us, it was a pretty small bill. It had a $200,000 cost to execute this bookkeeping charge, and they were willing to pay for it. They said, we want to pay for it on our licenses, just charge us a fee every year, $10 or $20 or whatever it is. We don't want a handout, we want to pay for this service that we want the government to provide. So you get that bill and you look at the TABOR implication of it. Here's the effect. If we're up against the excess revenue cap, We pass that bill and it brings in $200,000 of new revenue. All that happens is the refunds increase by $200,000. And then what has to happen on the other side? If it really costs you $200,000 to execute the service, we have to cut some other program by $200,000. And I looked at that as a businessman for 40 years, and I said, well, that's a bad process. That's not making our government better, making our government smaller. That's bad process. And just like you would do in your business or your personal life, you would look at it and say, okay, let's keep the good parts. Let's keep the ability to vote on taxes. Let's keep the balanced budget part. But let's get rid of the part of the process that creates an illogical construct for the legislature, where they can't do something that people have requested, that people are willing to pay for, without arbitrarily giving the money to, literally pennies when you divide it up, to people around the state and cutting some other program. It's an illogical construct. We ought to get rid of the excess revenue cap, keep the good parts of Tabor, and go on down the road. So, thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for this opportunity. I'm going to apologize in advance for my voice. I want to thank former Representative Thurlow. When he was in the legislature, we worked very closely together, and I have a lot of respect for him and what he's trying to do. But Proposition CC is not the right way to do it. In 2007, when my husband and I were looking for places to live, we chose Colorado because of the Taxpayer Bill of Rights. And when I tell people that, they kind of laugh. They're like, why would you choose to live in Colorado because of Tabor? And the reason we chose to live in Colorado because of Tabor is because we thought that any state that allowed you to vote on taxes and limits the growth of government must be the most free state that we could possibly live in. And our competition was New Hampshire and Tennessee, which are also pretty free states. But we chose to live here because we wanted to make sure that we could vote on our taxes and limit the growth of government, which we felt very strongly about. And so protecting Tabor, I agree with former Representative Thurlow. Protecting Tabor is the utmost obligation that we have. It has helped us from not overspending, from having a balanced budget. Now I want to talk to you specifically about Proposition CC, because there's a couple of buzzwords in CC that make you think, well, this is kind of good for us, right? So it starts out without raising taxes. Well, if you're not going to raise my taxes, I'm okay with that, right? Except that's kind of disingenuous, because what they're saying is we are going to keep your refunds indefinitely, so there's no sunset on this, but we're not raising your taxes. Well, if you owe the government $100 and you give them $200 and they don't give it back to you, that's raising your taxes, right? You paid more into government than they deserve to have. And so, so we want to make sure that we can vote on refunds going forward. So one thing that the legislature could have done was put in a sunset and say, hey, let's try this out for a couple of years and see if it works. Another thing they could have done was say, hey, we will tell you specifically what we're going to use this money out for. And you're going to say, well, Rose, I don't understand. In the ballot language, it says we're going to use it for higher education, and we're going to use it for transportation. All great things, right? Yes, all great things that should be funded. And we could talk more on a different day about the proper role of government and how that should actually work. But yes, all great things to be funded. However, they don't tell you where, how, or when that money is going to go to any of those things, or if it's going to go to any of those things. If they did, like in the past when there's been questions about transportation, they have said it is going to go specifically to these 5 projects, right? And for the record, you can't bond against this Tabor excess. So even if you do allow the government to have it, you can't bond against it because we don't know how much that excess will be each year or if there will be an excess at all. And so to keep that in mind that, you know, they talk about, well, we're gonna keep our excess forever. Well, they may or may not be in excess forever, but they're predicting about $1 billion over the next 3 years. So you have to ask yourself the question, do I really want the state government to have an additional $1 billion of my money? Or is there something else that we could be doing instead? And so the other thing that they have in that question, which is really interesting to me, is it says, in order to balance the budget. Well, as Representative Thurlow said, it is an obligation of the legislature to balance the budget. That's non-negotiable. You're not voting on whether or not they can balance the budget or not. They have to balance the budget. It's in the Colorado Constitution. So it's a little disingenuous when you see those buzzwords. You're like, well, these are good things. And collectively, they look great. But when you really truly delve down into it, it's the whole thing is not quite accurate. So let's talk about you know, teacher pay, right? I believe that teachers should get paid more. I believe more money should go in the classroom. I've got 2 little kids. I'm a mom of an 8-year-old and a 5-year-old, and education is probably one of the most important things for me right now. And teacher pay is specifically excluded from this measure. It cannot go to increase in teacher pay, and it cannot go to new teachers. So just keep that in mind. So here's what it's going to go for, in my estimation. The state government continues to grow, and we're right here in Delta County, which used to be a really strong coal-producing county. Well, when the government decided that coal wasn't good anymore, a lot of coal miners started losing their jobs, right? And so now the governor said, but I'm gonna help you. I'm gonna create this office of just transitions. Office of Just Transitions to transition you off of your coal jobs and into service jobs so that this way you still have work. Well, we all know those people are leaving. They're taking their families and they're moving to places where there's work. So what your money's gonna go to is to continuing to grow government in ways that we probably don't agree with. Office of Just Transitions, Office of Future Work, whatever that is. But the governor, through executive order, can just establish these offices, and eventually you're gonna have to pay for them one way or the other. But that doesn't mean that it's going to higher education. It doesn't mean it's going to, your refund money is going to go to higher education, or transportation. We all live on the Western Slope. We know the realities of living on the Western Slope. If you have been on the Front Range lately and sat in traffic, like I do frequently, you see there's a huge problem on the Front Range. How much of that money do you think is going to go to fix Highway 50 in Delta, or to fix I-25, or 29 road, to connect it to the interstate on I-70 in Grand Junction? How much of that money do you really think? Probably none, right? Because the priority, when they see that money, and if they do use it for transportation, which even the Speaker of the House said, we can't bind a future legislature, this is statutory, so we'll give the money to the legislature in the general fund, just a blank check, and we'll try to put it in the places it's supposed to go to, but there's no guarantee. And she even said that, the Speaker of the House said, there is no guarantee this money will go to those projects, or that a future legislature won't put that money into something else. So, I mean, if you want to give the government a blank check, I'm from the government, I'm here to help, and you trust that they're here to help you, then, you know, maybe you should consider it. But I am part of the government. I'm a Mason County Commissioner, and we have an excess. We're going to have about a $5 million excess in Mason County, and I didn't ask you for that money, because I'm going to work within the budget I have, just like our families have to work within the budgets they have. And so to me, it's just really important that we really understand, if they wanted to put it towards education and they really cared about teachers, they wouldn't have excluded teacher pay. They wouldn't have excluded hiring new teachers. What it's probably going to go for, to be honest with you, is the governor's plan for a full-day kindergarten, which more parents took advantage of than they thought were going to. And so now it's way over budget from what they expected, and they underfunded it to begin with. So where your money is probably going to go is to make sure that that program is funded for a short period of time, because refunds are not going to always be happening. We haven't had a refund in a while. You know, after the next 3 years, we're probably not going to have another refund, which means that then they're going to find another way to tax you. And this is just a slow taking away of the power of TABOR and what it does to really protect the people from government. If you want it, ask. But if you're going to ask, you need to be specific, and it shouldn't be forever. And so really what we want to make sure you understand is that it is forever. They will never have to ask you again. They will not have to tell you what it's for. Unless you're at the legislature, like former Representative Thurlow, and on the JBC and really understand where all the money goes, it's going to be very difficult for you to understand whether or not your tax refund actually went to education, higher education, or to transportation. But I can tell you right now, somebody said, well, I was talking about transportation specifically and projects and how do we guarantee it. And they said, well, you know, it depends on the people you vote for. Well, we vote for great people on the Western Slope to represent us. The problem is we can't control front range legislators. And so they're the ones who are going to be making this decision for all of us. So just keep that in mind. And I also want to point out one more thing on education as a lover of education. And I actually think full day kindergarten is a great program, and I do think we should actually have that. Optional, of course, but it needs to be funded. And if it's not funded, then you can't do it until you have the money to fund it. I mean, that's how we all live. We don't just buy stuff because we want them. We buy things when we have the money to buy them. And so the last thing I'm going to say on education is, remember marijuana? Now, this is a libertarian group. I did not vote for marijuana legalization for lots of reasons, and we can all disagree about what those reasons are. However, it was promised to us that that money was going to go to education. We need marijuana because, you know, it's not going to hurt our kids, and it's going to go to education, which actually helps our kids. So you're like, I mean, I voted against it, but okay. Except when that money came in, they did an audit, and not all the money was there, and they couldn't account for it. And then that marijuana money that's supposed to be going to the schools, they had tweaked the language where it's only for capital projects, and rural schools couldn't meet the criteria to get any of that money, or very small portions of it. So if you think these front-range legislators aren't going to take your money, and if they invested in education, higher education, and transportation, and it ain't all going on the front range, you got another thing coming, because our voice is smaller, and we know that, and we're going to continue to fight as much as we can, but just want you to keep that in mind. Thank you.
All right. So now we're going to move into the second round, where each speaker will respond to points made during the first round. Obviously, we'll be talking about marijuana now. And also, it should be noted that we should watch this very closely because Dan needs to make sure that he has a ride back to the airport. Rose actually drove him here, so if this goes poorly for him, you might have to get a volunteer for a ride back to the airport. So we'll go ahead and start off with
What's the time on this round?
10.
Thanks, Jay. I was thinking about that. That could be
I was just trying to help you out. Get other volunteers.
Well, I'm gonna try to just go through some of the things that Rose said. I know I won't get all of them taken care of. Some of them I think are big, some of them I think are little. I'm gonna start with the ones that I think are little. The marijuana thing is the biggest misconception, and I get it every place I go. People always say, "What happened to the marijuana money?"
Yeah.
I hate to say it, but the marijuana money, only in the last budget that I was there, which was 2 years ago, the marijuana, I hate to say only, but the marijuana money was only $160 million. People have this perception that it's a huge flood of money coming into the state budget, and it's just not. 160 million is half of what the givebacks are supposed to be under the TABOR refunds this year, so it is not a huge amount of money. And most of it is in the initial amendment. 40 million was supposed to go to schools, and I think we've increased that to construction. And the premise of that, it's the same thing as the premise of not including teachers in this issue, is it's not settled money, and you can't get it every year. You don't want to hire teachers one year and then not have the money to pay for them the next year. So the marijuana money, I wish it was there because you hear about it all the time. It's just not there. Here's what I think is the biggest issue that where I disagree with Rose, or where that I want everybody to understand though, and that's in ballot language that I admit it's not necessarily simple, but none of them are. You look at all these things, I suspect everybody has gotten their blue book in the mail, and in the blue book you can read the actual ballot language, and you can read pros and cons put out by everybody on CC and DD, which is the other issue. It's never simple. The biggest thing that's not simple is trying to assign the money to go to a particular place in a budget that you redo every year, and you combine that with the fact that money is fungible, and you combine that with the fact that we're a Democratic Republican, we elect new people every year to do the details of the budget. Now, I suppose a big way to solve it would be just put the budget on the ballot every year and let everybody vote on the budget. But I think most of you would agree that's impossible. It's too big and too much detail. So every ballot issue that I've ever read says, here's how we want to use the money, and I think that's a sincere statement of how the people that wrote the issue want to use the money. This is roads, education, and higher education. I absolutely understand that 20 years down the road, that doesn't have to necessarily be the case, because the new money comes in and you can track the new money, whatever was gonna, you can draw a line, an imaginary line, and say, this would have been refunds, and you can track it for 20 years. But the whole $30 billion budget that's underlying that had money for education and roads and higher education. And yes, 20 years down the road, people could be lowering this amount, you know, and still keeping the same money everywhere. But folks, it's an impossible task. And you're right, Rose and I are great friends, and I do not want to walk to the airport. But I can tell you, Mesa County passed a sales tax increase about 2 years ago. Rose was a big supporter of it, worked hard to get it passed.
I wouldn't go big supporter, but
It was a sales tax increase to fund public safety, the district attorney's office and the sheriff's office. It passed. What I remember, and I may not be absolutely correct, Rose, but I think it was supposed to bring in about $7 million a year, and of course that'll grow into the future. Well, the Mesa County budget, which I think is $180 million or something, has plenty of money in it for the sheriff and the DA. Well, I wouldn't say plenty of money, but has money in it for the sheriff and the DA. Rose and the other two commissioners that passed the bill made a good case and sincerely want the $7 million to be addition to the sheriff and the DA's budget. But I can also tell you that 10 years down the road, 20 years down the road, different commissioners could take money out of the underlying budget and use it for a different purpose. Budgeting just doesn't work that way. You can't assign it and then say, this is how it's always going to be. And I would also submit that you really don't want it that way, do you? 20 years down the road, 10 years down the road, things change. Things always change. And would you want the budget to be tied to something that we voted on, and 20 years down the road, things are different? If you haven't looked at Proposition DD, which is the next one on the ballot, it's exactly like that. It's the internet gambling initiative, asking if you want to okay an additional 10% tax on internet gambling. I shouldn't say additional, it's a new tax on internet gambling in Colorado. It could generate as much as $29 million, and it's going to go to water projects. Well, everybody likes water projects, but 20 years down the road, there's underlying money in the budget that now goes to water projects. You cannot guarantee that that equation won't change 20 years down the road. Money is fungible, and the representatives we have different visions, and times change. If global warming takes place, we might be a swamp in 20 years. And we wouldn't need any more water projects. Who knows? We would not want that to be nailed down in the budget. I don't know how much time I have left, but I want to just talk for a minute about the West Slope, East Slope division of money. The simple fact is that 80% of the people live over there on the East Slope. 20% live over here. They pay more in taxes than we do. Actually, the economy's been really good over there for a lot of years, and it hasn't been that great over here for a lot of years. So they're probably making more money, but they're also paying more money in taxes. The excess revenue and the TABOR refunds are because the economy's been really good. We generated more money from sales taxes and income taxes, at least 80%, and probably more than 80% of it, because again, it's not just population, it's the fact that they make more money over there, they're doing better, they're paying more taxes than we are. So more than 80% of the money has come from the East Slope. So here's our choice. Should we give the money back in TABOR refunds? which means that it doesn't go back exactly in proportion to what you paid, but somewhat it does. It's a complicated formula based on a lot of different things, but it stands to reason that the big share is gonna go back to the people on the eastern slope as opposed to the people on the western slope. Or would a better choice be to keep the money, fight the battle of where it's gonna be spent through the legislature? And Rose is right, we're at a disadvantage, you know, because I think there's 6 representatives from the western slope out of 65, and you know, 3 or 4 senators out of 35. Fight the battle, but isn't it better to keep the money and try to get some of it spent on our roads? And what I would also suggest is it doesn't even necessarily have to be our roads. I spent a lot of time when I was in the legislature driving up and down I-70 from Grand Junction to Denver. Well, I tell you, the bottleneck is from the Eisenhower Tunnel to downtown Denver. If they keep that money, use it for roads, and eventually are able to fix that bottleneck, that's a great service to western Colorado. To be able to get tourists coming from DIA up to the ski areas or over to Crested Butte or whatever, to be able to get our products that we produce over here down I-70 and into Denver in a more efficient way. That's a lot, to me, that's a lot more logical way to spend the $310 million is what the first year estimate is. Spend that on fixing I-70, even if it's on the eastern slope, then to give that money back in refunds that looks like they average around $36 depending on your economic situation. I think that's a lot better way to spend the money. That's all I've got.
Okay.
Thanks.
Friends can always disagree. So I'm going to touch on a couple of things that Representative Thurlow said. So first, I can guarantee that your refund money will go into roads in Mesa, Delta, Montrose on the western slope. You want to know how? If you take your refund check and you buy something in Mesa, Delta, or Montrose, you pay sales tax, right? And so you use that money, you pay sales tax. A portion of your sales tax goes into our county's capital fund. That capital fund is specifically for road infrastructure. So if you want to make sure your refund money works for transportation in your counties, spend your refund in your counties. I also want to say I've talked to a lot of statewide legislators and statewide candidates running for office who are on both sides of the aisles. I will say that this is across the board, who have said we need to fix I-70 to bail. They don't realize there's a place past bail on I-70. Apparently they don't drive to Utah. They definitely don't drive to Grand Junction, but they drive to the ski areas. So if we're concerned about getting tourists to ski areas so they can pump their money into those economies, then yes, give the government more of your money. I do want to talk about, and I mean no disrespect in what I say, but it's always funny when you hear politicians say it's only $160 million, right? Well, marijuana money wasn't that much. It was only $160 million. Well, $160 million could go really far for schools in Delta and in Mesa County and in Montrose County and some of these other places. But the fact of the matter is they still can't really account for all of it. And it wasn't sold to us that it was only going to go to buildings. It was sold that the money was going to go in the classroom. At what point does the money act children in the classroom? At what point? But it's not this. It wasn't marijuana, and it wasn't any of the other things that they told you that the money was going to go in the classroom, and then it never got there. So it's all about trusting the people that you put in these positions in the legislature, which, as Representative Thurlow said, we have very few of. I do want to talk about the public safety tax. I want to touch on that. That was not my initiative. I did vote to put it on the ballot and let the people decide. I thought that was an important issue, but I have also been advocating for the last 7 years in office, and I would love to somehow get to the state government in some way to be able to really start proffering this. But we need to think about budgets in a completely different way. What we need to start with is, what is the proper role of government? What are the things that government is supposed to be doing, right? Because there is a role for government. Even libertarians think there's a little bit of a role for government, right? We've expanded that role into things that may or may not need to be funded, but if we were to actually focus on the things that need to be funded, that people can't do for themselves, and put that on the priority list. And I've tried to do this in Mesa County, and I've gotten some pushback, but what I wanted to do, instead of going for a tax increase, was fund public safety. I mean, Representative Thurlow was right, I have a $156 million budget. I should have been able to fund public safety without asking for more money. But there were other things that need to be cut, and governments don't like to cut. And so Representative Thurlow had said, well, if you get that extra $200,000, you're gonna have to cut somewhere. I have yet to see the state government cut anything anywhere. And we have cut at a county level, and your Delta County commissioners and your Montrose County commissioners have, because we keep getting less and less money from property taxes. And so we just learn how to live within our budgets. Sometimes you need to ask the question. And if the people think that we have made a good enough statement, these are the things it's gonna go for, and you trust us and you give us more money, well then thank you for doing that. But the question today is whether you trust this state government and these state legislators to use the money that you give them in the appropriate way and for the benefit of the constituents on the Western Slope. That is the question before you. If your answer is yes, then vote yes. If your answer is no, then vote no. But I don't know that it can be really as simple as that. This is a trust question. I mean, $1 billion over 3 years is a lot of money for any government. And again, if they're not going to tell you where exactly it's going to go, that public safety money, we were very specific about where it was going to go, and that we cannot lower the sheriff's budget and then replenish it with this money. That was very specific, and that was a trust factor with our constituents. And we won't be here forever. I'm term limited out next year, but the commissioners that follow me will have to follow that guidance because that is what the people voted on. The problem with this question is you don't really know what you're voting on. You're voting to give $1 billion to the state government to use towards good, very good purposes, but with no guarantee that those purposes will actually be fulfilled or that any of that money will actually come to the Western Slope and be used to affect our families right here in our counties. So I think that is, I hate that word that money is fungible. We'll just move it around. And you trust us, right? Because you vote us in, so it's okay. I mean, that's the reality of how things work. But I also think there needs to be some accountability. Obviously, on a local level, we have to see you in the grocery store. And I don't live in Delta, but if you lived in Mesa, you will see me in the grocery store on Saturday morning with no makeup and hair flop with 2 little kids behind me. And I've got to see those constituents every day. They stop me on Main Street, they stop me in the city market. So when I take more of their money, I'm accountable to them because I see them, and I have to be. Your state government, I mean, your legislators here are great legislators. We all have great legislators on the Western Slope, but you don't have to see those Front Range legislators. They don't have to see you walking down Main Street. They don't have to see how you go down Highway 50 and it's bumpy. My kids call it the roller coaster. Are we going to do the roller coaster to Delta? They don't have to see that. They don't have to drive that. I mean, even if they're coming to Mesa County, they're not probably coming down this way unless they're going to Telluride ski area, right? So let's just make sure that money goes to the appropriate places, and I think we can do that in a different way than this ballot question. So thank you so much for your consideration.
So for this third round, we'll have you both just come up here. We just do the kind of the crossfire round. I don't really see the need of having people read off a card. So does anybody have any questions that they would like either one of these folks to answer?
Well, I have
Sure.
one for each actually. So start with Dan since he went first. Why eliminate the cap instead of voting to let the state keep the excess this time? And isn't that how TABOR was designed? So that being said, we should be able to ask, can we go into debt? Can we keep the excess? Can we raise taxes? Why eliminate the cap instead of just asking to keep it?
Maybe I'm not clear on the question, but if CC passes, you'll still be able to vote on taxes.
Right, so if CC passes, that cap goes away, and you never have to ask ever again, right? So why not just ask?
Not the tax, the excess revenue.
Right,
Okay.
they never have to ask whether or not to keep the excess ever again. So why not just ask if you can keep the excess this time?
I can't say, certainly there's a multiple of ways that the bill could have been written. The history of TABOR, there was a Proposition C in about, it was either 2004 or 2005, that asked that question, and there was a 5-year limit on it. That could have been done again. I didn't write the proposition, so you could ask for 5 years or 10 years or 20 years. I guess I go back to my policy argument is you should always be ready to look at it, and you should always be ready to change. You could go ahead and write it with a sunset, or you could do it the other way. Someone can easily come back in 2 years and say, no, this didn't work. The government's spending too much money or whatever. We want to put the excess revenue cap back on. You could put it on in a different way. Yeah, I actually ran a bill 2 years ago, which I was kind of fond of, and it was to change the definition of the excess revenue cap. Instead of having it be inflation plus population, I wanted to make it a measure of what we settled on was a 5-year rolling average of personal income in Colorado. And there were a couple of different measures that you could have used, but it was to try and tie it to something that's real for our state, that fluctuates with our economy up and down. That didn't make it to the ballot, but it doesn't mean someone couldn't do it again. So it doesn't, I guess to answer your question is we have elections every year, and there's ballot initiatives on the ballot every year. So if this one passes, or I suspect it'll happen. I don't care which way it goes. I think if this one passes or if this one fails, you'll see within another year or two, you'll see another ballot issue having to do with TABOR. It won't go away. The issues don't go away, and they shouldn't ever. But to me, that's logical to look at the processes and look at them every year, every 2 years, adjust them, ask the people again, is this what you wanted or not? And that's what the election's about. So could have been worded differently, and some people would agree to that. Some people would say 5 years, some people would say never. But again, it can go both ways. If it passes or if it fails, you'll see another one sometime, at least in the next 4 years, that will try and do something. My concern, because I think what it does is I'm a TABOR supporter, and if you follow elections at all in Colorado, you'll see that and I don't want to make this partisan, I know it's not a partisan group, but the more liberal elements in Colorado won the governorship, the state senate, and the state house. I would absolutely not be surprised to see a ballot measure saying let's do away with TABOR at all.
That's important, actually.
And you can't, but that's the way life is, that's the way politics is. So my pitch is that CC is a good stopgap for that. Let's make it work. It's a good policy because it does give you the ability to vote on the taxes. We have to have a balanced budget. If we got rid of the excess revenue cap, that in my view is what creates the turmoil and gums everything up. Let's get rid of that and see how it works for a couple of years until the next election, and you'll see one, I'm sure.
My question for Rose was, as you mentioned, there are programs that pop up every once in a while that are fee generators or revenue generators, and they don't really cost the state anything. So, in that being said, that is going to be a conflict with that excess cap. And what are some ways we can work around that to be able to allow those fee programs to be put in place, like we was talking about?
That's an interesting question, and I don't know that I've got a great answer for you on how we allow fees to be included. I guess my question back to you is, do you want them to keep raising your taxes through fees which don't need to be voted on? Because I don't. I would rather see them have to go to a ballot and say, hey, we need this money and here's what the money is going to be used for, and we're going to use it for this specific amount of time, as opposed to, we're going to continue to increase fees on you and you've got no say in that, and trust us, we're going to use that money. They did that with the faster fees, right? They increased faster fees and said, we're going to use these towards roads, and then there's no money towards roads. And then they, or if it is, it's going on the Front Range because there's so many projects there that cost way more than our projects over here, and so clearly that's where the people are, so let's put the money on the Front Range, which means that we are again at a disadvantage. So I don't know the real answer to your question, and maybe Representative Thurlow would have a better answer. I know I do want to respond to some of the things that he just said, but I think that fees is not a great way to get more money from the people without their consent.
You wanna?
If I can, I would
Sure.
throw out an idea. I don't think I can answer your question either, but I'll throw out an
I'll
idea.
think
I'll throw out an idea that I think that relates to your question, and it's what I saw in the 4 years that I was there is we've almost set up this disingenuous, and people love to hate politicians. I was a printer for 45 years, and the day after I got elected, I was a politician.
Fairness, you guys are easy targets.
Well, I'm not a politician anymore. It's only road. No, what I see that I think relates to your question is, when I was there, we've set up now almost a disingenuous relationship between the legislature and the citizens, and I think it's driven a lot by the excess revenue cap, because that money comes in through sales tax and income tax and some fees, and here it is, it's an amount, and then we get to this point and it has to go back. But I hate to say it, everybody still wants services. Everybody still wants roads. Everybody still wants good education. Everybody wants things. You may not want it in general, but I can't tell you how many times I had good conservative Republicans come to me and say, hey, I've got this particular thing, it's my bill, and it costs this much in here, and I would like it to be. So the legislature gets that pressure all the time. And so what happens is they look around and they set up things that are kind of disingenuous. They say, well, we're going to call this a fee instead of a tax, or we're going to create a different mechanism for giving back the excess revenue. We did that a couple of years ago. It's the senior homestead exemption. I don't want to go into that because it's a whole long another story. But that's what I would suggest the bad policy does. If you have bad policies in your organization, again, I hate to keep going back to the printing business, but that's what I know. If we had a bad policy, and the guys on the shop floor knew it, and they were running their press and they're trying to get consistent color, and our policy said do this, 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 and that wasn't working, they would go around the policy because they had to put out a good product. So if you have a bad policy, it drives bad performance and bad decisions. If we made the policy better, and maybe we try it for 2 years or 4 years or 6 years and see how it works, I think it would get rid of some of the things that are happening now with fees being called taxes being called fees and different things that try to deliver the service without actually calling it a tax.
So can I respond to something that Robert had that Dan has said?
Absolutely.
So Dan talked to you about how we have, not to be partisan, but we have a Democrat governor and a Democrat legislature on both sides. And the reason that they didn't put a sunset or do what Dan said, which is, well, let's just try it out and see if it works and see if there's any tweaks that need to be made, is because they don't want to come back and ask you again. Right. And if you think that this isn't one step closer to repealing TABOR, they're gauging the temperature of the water of Colorado with this Prop CC question. And they took kind of an easy one. I mean, of all the things that you could probably rally people around, the excess revenue cap is probably one that even Republicans probably agree with removing. So that's why one in the legislature. I don't know generally, but that's something that people could, reasonable people can say, hey, maybe this doesn't work as well as it should, maybe. But what they're doing is testing the water, because next year they're going to put a full repeal on the ballot in 2020, and so they want to see if CC passes. Then they're like, oh, well, the people are amenable to giving us more money, and maybe there are ways that we can do this in the repeal. Now, if it doesn't pass, I think that they will have to look at the repeal in a very different way than what they're expecting to do. So this will be very interesting to see. But I was going to use this in my closing, but I'll use this real quick. Do you remember last November when we voted to protect the oil and gas industry in Colorado? The people voted overwhelmingly saying, stop messing messing with the oil and gas industry in Colorado. And then that legislature went in and did the most egregious things to the oil and gas industry, and we've only seen the tip of the iceberg. So, for them to say, trust us, give us more money, it's going to education, higher education, and transportation, trust us. Can you actually trust the people who literally undid a vote of the people?
So I'm going to actually take moderator's privilege here, because
Okay.
that's a good stepping stone here. So there are some that are seeing CC as a bit of a guinea pig right now, right? If passed, do you see CC being a green light for policies that might be contrary to those who are in favor of the new government?
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, Office of Just Transition, there's no way to fund that unless they get more money from you. The Office of Future Work, there's no way to fund that unless they get more money from you. Full day kindergarten, and now full day pre-K, and then preschool. There's no money. There is no money. So once you give them a little bit more money, if you think that's all they're gonna ask from you, you're wrong, because government, I mean, if you're a limited government person, you need to work within what you've got. And if you ask for more, it's because you're desperately needing more money, and you can literally look the people in the eye and explain it to them. That is not what this legislature is doing. And it's a different legislature than Representative Thurlow had to deal with, because it's just a different makeup. And so, yes, this is a green light to increasing a lot of things, to pay for a lot of things that grow government.
Crystal ball work, Jay, is hard, you know, looking into the future and saying, here's what is gonna happen with this or with that. I have no doubt that as Rose says, there are some people that really would like to create a lot more programs and spend a lot of money. That's always been the case. That's been the case from 1776. I mean, that's just the nature of government. There are people that don't want that to happen. So, you know, the crystal ball question, I guess, is, well, what effect would CC, whether it passes or fails, would it encourage the people that want to spend more because now they have more? I don't know. I don't know there's any way to figure that out. What I still would say is that it's bad procedure, and it leads us to bad decisions. I'll give you a separate one that I mentioned earlier, because I mentioned the one where we had the bill where you bring in more money and it just leads to bigger refunds. We also deal a lot of times with tax exemptions or tax credits. And here was the other thing that just mystified me when I figured out how it works. If you pass a tax credit for something to encourage, if you pass a tax credit to encourage environmental fixing up rivers or whatever, or if you exempt somebody from sales tax, it results in less money coming into the general fund. If we're up against the TABOR cap, all that happens is the refunds become smaller. So that's the other side of the coin, and I hate to sound like a broken record, but for us to fix the process first, then we'll deal with the politics, because you'll always have the liberals and conservatives that want bigger government, more spending, or less government and less spending. But if the process is broken, if you have a process where you pass a bill that brings in more money and it doesn't create anything, it just creates bigger refunds, or a process that on the other side gives somebody a tax break, brings in less money, and that doesn't create less money for the government, it just creates smaller refunds, that's a broken process. If we fix the process, we will always be able to argue about the spend or not spend, liberal versus conservative. That argument will go on, has gone on forever, and it will go on forever. But we should fix our budgeting process in Colorado, and we could have a better, more honest debate about it. That's my contention.
LG?
I have a question, for either of you. in Utah, where I moved from 3.5 years ago, there is a rainy day fund, okay? Does this, the TABOR revenue cap prevent savings toward a rainy day fund? I mean, do you have to put it in the budget? What, I'm not exactly,
Well, you can't do it in Colorado. You can, the cap is here. And there's a cash reserve. The budget has, it's just like your business budget or family budget. It's got spending, but it's also got a balance sheet side where there's cash here and the cash comes in and goes out, and there's always a cash reserve, money in the bank. And if money comes in that pushes us over the cap, that's where the refunds come from, is the cash reserve.
Could they spend less?
Well, no, that's what's odd. It doesn't have to do with spending. If the money comes in that's up against the cap, you can spend less, but that doesn't mean that you still have to give back the refunds. It's all about how the economy does and how much money is coming in through sales taxes and income taxes and fees. So no, you can spend less if you want, but you still have to give the refunds. That's what I'm saying is it creates, it's not helping to limit the size of government. The being able to vote on tax rates that's helping very much. And having to have a balanced budget is. But the excess revenue cap is not helping to limit government. You could spend less or you could spend more. It has nothing to do with that cap. That cap is there, and if the money comes in over the cap, you give it back. It creates a dislocation. It's a bad process.
But if you take the cap away, then they have more money to spend, which does, and potentially grow government.
Yeah, but and keep in mind, the money that we're talking about, and I know 160 million is a lot, but when you talk about that budget, it's not a lot. It's about 1% of the total budget. The 300 million that we're talking about the first year is about 1% of the total budget.
who can't cut
Yeah.
1 penny out of 100? I mean, who can't? That's 1%, that's not that much.
In comparison to the whole, it's not a huge deal.
So just to clarify what you're saying is if the Colorado government collects, if the cap is at 100 million, right? And they only spend 90 million, they have to return the 10 million. No.
That's
So
not
why
how it
can't they
works.
just spend less to create that rainy day fund? Is what I was
The
saying.
way it works, if the excess revenue cap, which it's a line drawn on a graph, started clear back in 1992, and it's been adjusted for Ref C, and it's been adjusted for a whole bunch of other things over the course of time. But it's a line that this year, I think, is right around $14 billion. I'm not exactly sure. Well, if all of the taxes and if the general fund revenue comes in at 13.8, is of no consequence. But if the general fund revenue comes in at 14.1, then there's 0.1 has to be refunded to taxpayers. It doesn't, it doesn't matter if we spend $1 billion less. We could then put money in a bank, but anytime we're over that limit, that money has to be refunded.
I have never seen the government not spend every dollar that you.
Right. And I agree with that, but that's not the point. The point is that we create irrational ways of dealing with it because it's an arbitrary number that has nothing to do with the way Colorado actually grows and the way the money comes in.
Any other questions at all?
Just kind of curious, one of the biggest issues here in Delta County is our rural municipalities, special districts, et cetera, are subject to the combination of TABOR and Gallagher together, and it's really hurting them. For example, our library has $600,000 per year decreased revenue since 2012. And that's just really concerning to me as a mom and living in rural Colorado. And CC does nothing to help local or rural special districts or governments. I find that very concerning. So any advice, any thoughts on if I'm wrong maybe, but how does or how does that help us here locally?
It doesn't. I mean, because everybody's different, right? Like, it's not gonna help your county government, it's not gonna help your state. It's gonna help the state, but it's not gonna trickle down to any of the other governmental agencies. Honestly, and I wasn't being facetious when I said this, if you take your tax refund and spend it in Delta County, a percentage of that will go towards roads and infrastructure, which is good for business, it's good for, but it's not gonna directly go to library services.
So what are some of the solutions to that? That, you know, TABOR going away altogether is not something I think that, you know, I certainly don't agree with, but how do you fix the combination of those issues? Honestly, I don't care if the state has more money, but I do care that my local library stays open. So those are things that really matter.
I think, first, you're right, I think the CC right now is not gonna solve the problem you're talking about. And we could go on for days about the intersection of Tabor and Gallagher and things. It's a very complicated problem.
Yeah.
I would point out that I think the number is 80% of the special districts, library districts, school districts, counties, people that have had exactly this kind of Tabor election on a local basis. I think 80% of them win. Because I think it's probably harder to, or maybe it's easier to grasp when it's your own library district that, hey, here's what we got all this money, we've got money coming in, but we can't spend it. And then when we have a bad year, we don't have it. I think it's easier to grasp it with a smaller entity. And I also think people trust their local politicians that they can see and talk to more than they trust the big bad legislators from the East Slope. And I agree with Rose, all the ones from the West Slope are good guys. But it's those other guys that are the problems.
Did you want to respond to that at all? Or you?
Oh,
you
I
did, you
did,
did.
yeah.
So then I guess I'll ask a question then. So there's always so much emphasis on Tabor. Why is there never any backlash or trying to address Gallagher?
There is. They have some there was an interim committee, I want to say for the last 2 years of the legislature on Gallagher and what some of the fixes are. I think, and I'm not gonna, Gallagher is incredibly complicated. I normally, if somebody asks me a Gallagher question, I bring my assessor up here and I'm like, here you go, that's the guy who knows anything. Because he can tell you about the intersection, what needs to be done and whatnot. But I think there's just a lot of disagreement on how to fix it, and because everybody can't come together to find a solution, it's why we're continuing to have these problems.
And if I could just chime in, I think the difference with Gallagher, Tabor, I think is susceptible to a statewide solution. Gallagher is very specific to the growth in the community that you're in. What Gallagher does, it limits the property assessments can only grow, residential can only grow at a certain rate vis-a-vis commercial. And if you've had some really high growth, like in the Denver area, if it wasn't for Gallagher, those people would be paying 3 and 4 times the property taxes on the houses than they were when they bought them 20 years ago. We haven't had that kind of growth over here, but the opposite, because they set a statewide residential assessment rate, and it covers the whole state. So the effect is it ratchets down all the money to the special districts over here because we haven't had the growth in property values. The places where we've had the growth in property values, and again, every community is different, but if your house value grew at the average of the state, it doesn't affect you because the residential assessment rate goes down, but your value went up, so you pay about the same in property tax. Over here, we have not, the property tax hasn't increased, but the money generated then constantly goes down if the special district is dependent on property tax. So what I think is happening is I don't think it's susceptible necessarily. There are some committees working to look for a statewide solution, but what's also happening is there's lots of ballot measures, and I call them de-Gallagherization. It's like the de-Brucing elections. They're now starting to, all around the state, you'll see popping up, I don't know if there's one in Delta or not, but I know there's one over in Parker where I live, where the special district is asking the question, it goes something like, irregardless of Tabor and Gallagher, can we increase our mill levy to keep the same dollar flow that it was before the last readjustment of the residential assessment rate. And those are starting to take place every year, and they in effect exempt that entity from the Gallagher amendment. That's a piecemeal way to solve the problem. It may be the only way.
Yeah, we don't have de-Gallagherization, that's a mouthful to say. What you're seeing right now in Delta is that we actually have, like our school districts, our library districts, all of our municipal and county law enforcement, and who else? The Cedar Ridge Fire Department. Am I forgetting any? Those are all gonna be voting for, we're putting a mill levy on the ballot too, so it's kind of the piecemealing of everybody asking for more taxes through the mill levy process, so, yeah. I'll ask one more crystal ball question, then we'll move on to our next round. Where do both of you see Tabor in 10 years?
Depends if they repeal it next year or not. I mean, it may be non-existent. I think especially with this legislature and this governor who do not want to be restrained. I think that they will continue to pick at it. Now, if CC fails, which, you know, depends on who you talk to. I talk to people all over the Western Slope, and I feel like it's going to fail out here, but who knows what people in Parker are going to do. But, but if this fails, then at least the bites will be smaller. If this passes, I think it's going to be one fell swoop.
Again, crystal ball question, I have no idea where Tabor will be in 10 years, but I know neither one of us knows what, trying to say what will happen if this happens or that happens. My pitch to everybody is if we straightened out the process issues, then Tabor would be much more sellable. It would work better for the state. And if it works better for the state, people are less likely to repeal it. If the process works, it will garner less opposition than if the process doesn't work. So, vote yes on CC.
All right, any more questions? All right, so then we'll go on to our final round. Dan will start us off for his closing arguments.
Oh, Jay, I feel
5 minutes.
I don't have 5 minutes left. These people have heard me say this kind of thing enough times now to know what my pitch is. And it's a simple pitch. It's that, Tabor's good for Colorado. And what is good is the ability to vote on tax rate changes and the balanced budget amendment. And that's the solid number that you can count on to keep our budget in check and keep our government from growing too big. The excess revenue cap is a constraint to doing that. The excess revenue cap just creates the dislocations, the things that I've talked about with different bills and tax credits, which I won't go over again, but it just creates an illogical decision-making process for the legislature. And we should get rid of it. We should just go back to straight. We've got to vote on every tax rate increase, and we can't deficit spend. So thank you very much. I appreciate everybody coming out.
I want to know why roads aren't getting fixed in Delta and Montrose and Mesa County, because CDOT took the money that they had in their budget to build a new building in Denver because they really, really, really needed a new building. I would say that money would have been better spent actually in our roads, and if the people are sitting around building, then they're not fixing our roads. So maybe they should spend less time out of their building and more time outside. So just gonna put that in. So basically, this proposition CC starts with without raising taxes. That's a fallacy. They are raising your taxes. If they weren't raising your taxes, they wouldn't have to ask you for more money, right? There's no sunset on here because they don't want to have to come and ask you again. They just want you to write them a blank check. And once you write it, they can use it for whatever they want, because even the Speaker of the House said we cannot bind future legislators or even this legislature. So we think the money is going to go in the classrooms. We know that it's not. They've already said it cannot go to teacher pay increases and it cannot go to add more teachers. And as Representative Thurlow said, this money, may or may not come in, so they can't hire new teachers because they don't know that the money's going to be there. Well, likewise, they shouldn't be adding new offices in the governor's office if they don't know if the money's going to be there. They shouldn't be starting new programs like full-day kindergarten, which again, I'm very much a supporter of as a mom of 2 little kids, but not if it's not going to be funded. You just can't spend money without there being some restraint on government. And as a limited government person who really wants to make sure government lives within its means the way your households live within your means, I want to make sure this legislature and future legislatures live within their means. Now, they could just ask us. They could just give us specific projects. We could know where that money is going, but they don't want you to know where the money is going. Because if they just add it to the general fund and they can spend it any way they want, they can spend it on continuing to create more and more programs that they think is in the best interest of Colorado, despite what voters think is in the best interest of Colorado. And we have seen that firsthand. So I'm voting no on Proposition CC, regardless of the fact that I would love more money for education and transportation, obviously, but there's no guarantee that money is going to go to the projects it's supposed to, and there's no project list, and there's no guarantee any of that money will be spent on the western slope. And so we need to keep that money local. We need to use our refunds maybe to pay for some of these tax increases that our local governments need. There's so many other ways you can use that money to invest right here in our own communities. And so I encourage you to do that. So please vote no on CC. Thank you.
All right, so let's go ahead and give a round of applause. Looks like Dan's getting that ride back to the airport. So what we're going to do now, we had you guys all do a pre-vote. Now we're going to do the post-voting. We're going to see who the winner of the debate is. And while we're doing that, I'll go ahead and wait for Scott to hand out all the ballots. I'm going to present a little bit about what the...
Do we get to vote?
Did you? Yeah. But you didn't.
Well, you kind of know how they voted before. And since I have a little bit more of a candid audience, I was going to share what the Libertarian Party's position is on this issue. I'll wait for voting. Sway either way. We'll have Scott do the tallying here in a little bit. So I just want to say thanks for coming out. I know there's a lot of things you could be doing on this beautiful Saturday. So it means a lot for folks to actually care about what's going on locally at the state level, to educate themselves, ask legislators, ask county commissioners these types of questions. So I really appreciate that. But I want to start off with a little rhetorical question. How many in this room have heard the term debrucing? So if you're not familiar, debrucing is the process of putting this question to the ballot like what CC is. CC is asking to debruce the state government. So one of the original people that wrote the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, his name was Douglas Bruce, so it's kind of a nod to him. And what the question is that this can happen at the local level, this can happen at the state level, is that whatever level of government is in question here has to ask their constituents, we have extra money that we've taken in more than we can based off of TABOR. Can we keep it, or can we do we have to give it back to you guys as refunds? So debrucing is the process of voting on giving permission to government to keep that money for whatever purposes they lay out on the ballot. How many of you have ever heard of rebrucing? No hands, because there's never been a rebrucing effort, ever.
So, as a true libertarian, I'm going to be very contrarian about this resolution and say that I agree and disagree with the resolution. I agree that TABOR is outdated. I disagree with Proposition CC. And here's the thing. I actually think TABOR needs to go on the offense. Since 1992, TABOR has been on the defense. It has been chipped away at very slowly, and it's been always a very gradual thing. So one of the tricks that was actually referenced earlier too, is that as long as you can prove that something's not a tax, you can find ways of circumnavigating TABOR restrictions. And we've seen that in two very specific things. The first one was mentioned was fees. Faster was something that came out shortly after TABOR was passed, actually I think it was early 2000s, where money was generated just simply through raising all of your car registration. I think they actually found out that overnight they collected somewhere like $31 million in late fees just based off of Faster. And this is all money that goes into the budget, into the general funds for the state, that doesn't have to be susceptible or accountable through the TABOR process. And as a result, we've actually seen this kind of shuffle game, the shell game, right? Where things that could be considered a tax become a fee. And as a result of that, Colorado, about 20% of the state government is generated, the revenue is generated through fees, and the national average is about 11%. So we're twice the national average just based off of fee collection. Enterprises are essentially state-owned businesses that are exempt from TABOR restrictions. And there's some good arguments for enterprises, things like, say, a state school that wants to build a dorm and they want to bond out a dorm or bond out a fund for their dorms, use the money that they collect in tuition fees and payments that way to repay back the bond. And I think there's some good faith efforts in that regard. But we saw in the hospital provider fee with a really large enterprise that brought a bunch of money overnight that was not restricted by TABOR. And I had a figure here that I wanted to share with you because I thought it was amazing. I've been doing a lot of research on this. According to analysis by the Colorado Legislature Council staff, in 10 years following TABOR's passage, enterprise revenue jumped from $742 million in 1994 to $11.2 billion in 2014, which is a 1,409% increase. And enterprise revenue now makes up nearly half of the Colorado state budget. So that's half of the budget that can't be touched by TABOR. So I actually believe that TABOR needs to be strengthened. I think we need to create more bulwarks that specify language about what's a fee, what's an enterprise, what's a tax, and actually find a way of being a little bit more specific about that type of language. Because ultimately there's a lot of money that can just be reshuffled just by rebranding it in a different way. And the process of doing that, it's not really up for me to decide. I think that's another thing that's probably would have to go to the ballot. But ultimately though, what we're seeing is the slow deterioration of these rights. And once they go away, they're gone. Right. They're gone. They don't come back. And we're actually seeing also restrictions on the ability for us to petition our government too. So Amendment 71 passed recently, which sets a really higher threshold of getting these types of measures on the ballot. So TABOR was not passed by thoughtful politicians that got together and said, gosh, we really need to restrict how much we spend. TABOR was a citizen petition driven process that failed, I think, 3 times before it became law. But either way, it was a process of citizens getting together and gathering petitions and getting this on the ballot and getting it passed. And now that they're trying to increase the threshold of what it takes to have a citizen petition, the likelihood of, if TABOR ever gets repealed, of a similar process happening, is probably not going to happen. So ultimately, it's time for TABOR to see some type of rebuilding efforts. And I think that's where it's very important for even issues like referendum CC that those things get voted down. But either way, that's the libertarian position on it. Scott, we all set on voting?
We are,
Okay, so will you give us the first?
the Taxpayer Bill of Rights is outdated and requires reforms such as Proposition CC. Originally, people agreed were 1, disagreed with 7, and undecided were 2.
Okay,
For the second round, it was agreed was 1, disagreed was 8, and undecided was 1. So
one person changed their mind, all right.
I think I need to qualify the agree here because the first agree, there was a little note that says agrees with, that it requires changing, but didn't agree with Proposition CC.
Okay,
So,
that's why I said such as.
it's such a,
All right, so obviously the winner of our debate is Rose, so thank you, Rose. We also want a special thanks for Dan for making the trip out here. So yeah, so if you guys like these types of things, obviously keep a close eye on us. You can follow us on Facebook, Libertarian Party of Delta County. We're also reaching out to the Republican and Democratic parties too to see if this is something they want to, promote as well. So I think it's good that people come out, learn the issues, talk, and if you're still interested, we Libertarians meet at Needle Rock first Saturday every month, 6 o'clock in the chef's table room that's right above the bar area. So you're more than welcome to join us. And then also just get out and vote, guys. A lot of these things, what we're talking about are happening at the state level, but don't forget what's happening at the local level. Make sure you're showing up to your city council meetings, county commissioner meetings, all that fun stuff. So thanks again for coming, guys.
thanks, Jay.
Appreciate it. Yeah.
I said I'm really disappointed in the turnout, but I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Yeah, it was great. Right.
Nice to meet you.